You don't have to stay." That was the first thing Ethan McAllister said to her. Not hello, not welcome. Just those 5 words, flat and honest as the Wyoming sky, the moment Clara Whitmore stepped off the stagecoach with one battered trunk and no apology in her eyes. She looked at him, really looked the way people only do when they've already decided something, and said, "I didn't come this far to leave." The driver threw her trunk down into the dust. Neither of them moved to pick it up. That was how it started. If this story already has your heart, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale travels. Subscribe and stay with us all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what Clara is hiding. Ethan McAllister had written the advertisement 3 times before he sent it. The first draft was too proud. The second was too desperate. The third, the one he finally folded into an envelope and mailed to a Boston agency, without letting himself read it again, said something honest and plain. Rancher, late 30s, Wyoming. Hard life, good land, decent man. Seeking a wife willing to build something real. He hadn't expected anyone to answer. He certainly hadn't expected Clara Whitmore. Her letter arrived 6 weeks later, written in a hand so precise it looked like something carved rather than written. She said she was 28. She said she had no family left in Boston. She said she wasn't afraid of hard work, and she wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for a life that meant something. She did not describe herself. She did not mention anything about her past, except in one sentence that Ethan read 4 times before he folded the letter away. There are things about me that are difficult to explain, but I promise you they will never be a burden. He should have asked what that meant. He didn't. He sent the train fare and the date of the stagecoach, and then he spent the next 3 weeks barely sleeping, checking the fence line twice a day, repainting the porch rail he'd meant to fix for 2 years, and telling himself he was not nervous. The morning the stagecoach was due, Ethan stood outside the Millhaven post office with his hat in his hands and his stomach in a knot he couldn't name. His ranch hand. Cody Briggs, 19 years old and incapable of keeping his mouth shut, leaned against the hitching post beside him and said, "What if she takes one look at you and gets back on the coach?" "Then she gets back on the coach," Ethan said. "You don't mean that." "I might." Cody grinned. "You repainted the porch rail." Ethan put his hat back on. "The rail needed paint." "You painted it twice." "Cody?" "Yes, sir." "Go check on the horses." Cody did not go check on the horses. He stayed exactly where he was, and when the stagecoach rolled in from the eastern road in a cloud of red dust and axle noise, both of them watched it come. The door opened. 2 men got out. Then a woman in a gray travel coat stepped down, one hand on the doorframe, the other holding her hat against a gust of wind that came off the plains like it had been waiting for her. She was smaller than Ethan had pictured. He didn't know why he'd pictured anything at all. But she was smaller, slight, with dark hair pinned back, and a face that gave nothing away. She scanned the street the way a person scans a room they've just walked into, alone, carefully, quickly reading every exit. Her eyes found him. He knew they did, because she stopped scanning. He crossed the street without deciding to, stopped 3 feet from her, said the only thing that came out, "You don't have to stay." And she said without flinching, without a single second of hesitation, "I didn't come this far to leave." Behind him, Cody said very quietly, "I'll go check on the horses." The ride back to the ranch was 20 minutes by wagon and almost completely silent. Ethan drove. Clara sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her trunk secured in the wagon bed. The wind moved through the grass on both sides of the road. The sky was enormous and pale and full of light that had nowhere to go. He tried twice. "Long journey from Boston." "Long enough," she said. A full minute of silence. "The house isn't much. I fixed the porch." "That's kind of you." He gave up and let the horses lead. But he noticed things. The way her eyes never stopped moving, not nervously, but attentively, taking in the land, the ridgeline, the way the grass bent in the wind. like she was reading something he couldn't see. She had a stillness about her that wasn't coldness. It was closer to patience, the kind that comes from having learned the hard way that panic changes nothing. He noticed she didn't ask him anything, not about the ranch, not about the town, not about what he expected from her or what the winters were like or whether there were neighbors close enough to visit. She just looked at the land, and whatever she thought about it, she kept entirely to herself. When the ranch came into view, the main house, the barn, the two smaller outbuildings, all of it clean and functional and completely without softness, she said one thing. "You built all of this alone." "Started with my father," Ethan said. "Finished alone." She nodded once. Like that answered something she'd been wondering. The house felt different with another person in it. Ethan had lived alone for 6 years since his father died and his younger brother left for California and never wrote. He knew every sound the house made, the particular creak of the third floorboard in the hallway, the way the kitchen window whistled when the wind came from the north, the silence that settled in after dark that was less like quiet and more like wait. Clara moved through the kitchen without asking where anything was. She opened cabinets until she found what she needed. She located the flour, the salt, the iron skillet, and had something on the stove before Ethan had finished carrying her trunk upstairs. When he came back down, the smell hit him first. Something warm. Something that had no business smelling like home in a house that hadn't felt like one in years. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I was hungry," she said. "There's enough for 2. He sat down at the table because he didn't know what else to do. She set a plate in front of him. Biscuits and salt pork, and something with dried herbs he didn't recognize. She sat across from him. She did not wait for him to speak. "I want to be useful," she said. "I don't know what that looks like here yet, but I'll figure it out. I'm not slow and I'm not fragile, whatever I might look like." Ethan looked up from his plate. "I didn't say you were." "You thought it when you saw me." He didn't answer. She allowed herself a small, dry expression that wasn't quite a smile. "That's all right. People usually do. I've stopped being bothered by it." He picked up his fork. "What do you know about ranching?" "Nothing," she said honestly. "But I learn fast, and I keep what I learn. There's no shame in not knowing. There's just a lot of work." "Good," she said. "I work better when there's a lot of it." He studied her for a moment. Really studied her the way he hadn't let himself do at the stagecoach stop. She met his gaze directly. No flinching, no performing, no trying to make him comfortable with what she was. Just a woman sitting across a table telling him the truth about herself with the same plainness he'd used in that advertisement. He thought, this might actually work. He thought, she's hiding something. He thought both things at exactly the same moment and finished his supper without saying either one. The first week was a negotiation conducted entirely without words. Clara woke before sunrise. Ethan knew this because he woke before sunrise too, and she was always already in the kitchen when he came downstairs. Fire-lit coffee made whatever quiet task she'd found for herself already underway. She did not ask for his approval. She did not ask for instructions. She watched how things were done once and then she did them. She was never in the way. She was never idle. And she never in that entire first week went anywhere near the barn. Ethan noticed this on day 4. He'd expected her to wander. Most people who arrived from the east had something to say about the horses. Either they were afraid of them, or they were fascinated by them. Clara was neither. She stayed out of the barn entirely, without ever being asked to, without ever explaining why. On the morning of day 5, Cody pulled Ethan aside behind the water trough and said, "She's something, that one." "She's doing fine," Ethan said. "She reorganized the tool shed." "I know." Without being asked. "I know, Cody." "She also fixed the latch on the chicken coop. The one you've been saying you'd fix since February." Ethan looked at him. "I'm just saying," Cody said, holding up his hands. "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect? Some soft city woman who'd cry when it rained." He glanced toward the house. "She hasn't cried once. Has she cried? I feel like she hasn't cried. People don't cry on a schedule, Cody. Some do. Go mend the north fence. Cody went. And Ethan stood where he was for a moment longer, looking toward the house, thinking about what Cody had said, and about what Clara had said on that very first night. I'm not slow, and I'm not fragile. She was right about that. But there was something else. Something beneath the competence and the self-possession, something she kept locked behind her eyes. And Ethan, who had spent most of his adult life being careful not to want things he couldn't name, was beginning to feel the shape of a question he didn't know how to ask. The question got harder to ignore on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after her arrival. Ethan was working the near pasture when he heard his mare Duchess screaming. Not the irritable sound a horse makes when she's annoyed. The full tearing sound a horse makes when something is wrong, when she's hurt or cornered, or about to go over the edge of whatever self-control an animal of that size possesses. He dropped his tools and ran. By the time he reached the pasture gate, Duchess was rearing back, legs planted, front hooves cutting at the air, the whites of her eyes showing all the way around. She'd been skittish for a week. Ethan didn't know why. She'd thrown Cody twice and nearly taken out a section of fence the day before. He grabbed the gate and froze. Clara was inside the pasture. She was standing 15 feet from the horse with her back straight and her arms at her sides, and she was doing nothing. No rope, no crop, no voice commands, no cautious sidestep approach. She was just standing there, looking at Duchess, and something about the stillness of it stopped Ethan's hand on the gate before he could open it. Duchess reared again. Her scream split the morning air. Clara did not move. "Clara!" Ethan's voice came out low and urgent. "Get out of the pasture!" She didn't answer him. She didn't look at him. Her entire attention was on the horse. And then something happened that Ethan could not explain and would spend a long time trying to. Clara exhaled, slow and even, the way a person breathes when they are teaching their own body to be calm. She dropped her chin slightly. Her shoulders, which had been straight in that rigid, self-contained way of hers, dropped by half an inch, just half an inch. And she made a sound. Not a word, not a command. Something lower than language. Something that started in her chest and came out into the air between her and the horse, like a thread being pulled between 2 points. Duchess landed. Her front hooves hit the ground, and the trembling in her hindquarters slowed, and her head came down, and she stood there, breathing hard, looking at Clara with those huge dark eyes, and she did not move away. Clara took one step toward her, then another. By the time she was close enough to touch the horse's jaw, Duchess had dropped her head to Clara's shoulder and was standing still as a monument. Ethan's hand fell off the gate. Behind him, Cody said very quietly, like a man in church, "What in the world?" Ethan didn't say anything to Clara about what he'd seen. Not that morning, not at supper, not in the 2 days that followed. He watched her more carefully now. The way she moved around the ranch, precise, unhurried, always reading the space before she entered it. The way she paused at the door of the chicken coop before she went in, always letting the birds settle before she crossed the threshold. The way she'd once stopped halfway across the yard and stood perfectly still while a wild magpie landed 3 feet from her, pecked at the ground for a full minute, and flew away. And she hadn't done it deliberately, hadn't posed for it. She just hadn't scared it. He thought about her letter. "There are things about me that are difficult to explain." On the third morning after the incident with Duchess, he found her at the kitchen table before dawn, a cup of coffee at her elbow, reading a small book he didn't recognize. She closed it when she heard him on the stairs. "You don't have to close it on my account," he said. "Old habit," she said. He poured himself coffee, sat down across from her. The fire popped once and went quiet. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Ask." "What you did with Duchess. In the pasture." He watched her face for the flinch. It didn't come. "I need to know what that was." A long beat of silence. She looked down at her coffee cup, turned it once in her hands. When she looked up, something in her face had changed. Not opened exactly, but shifted slightly, like a door that's still closed, but no longer locked. I don't fully understand it myself, she said. I never have. Try. She looked at him for a moment, measuring something. Then she said, I can hear what they're feeling. Animals. Not words. Not thoughts. But the feeling underneath everything. Fear, pain, confusion. Whatever's driving them. I can hear it the way you hear a sound from another room. She paused. And sometimes, if I'm very still, I can answer it. Not in any way I can explain. I just... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I just match it. Whatever they're carrying, I carry with them for a moment. And it calms them. Silence. Ethan set down his coffee cup. How long have you had this? Since I was a child. Does it work with people? Something crossed her face, quick gone before he could read it fully. No, she said. People are more complicated. He nodded slowly, turned his cup in his hands the same way she'd turned hers. Is that why you left Boston? She went very still. He said, You don't have to answer that. No, she said quietly. You deserve an answer. She looked at the table. There was a man. Before. Someone my family approved of, which should have been my first sign. He found out about this, what I can do, and he didn't see a gift. He saw something he could use. He wanted me to train horses for his racing stable and tell no one why they improved. He wanted the profit without the person. A pause. When I refused, he made sure my reputation in Boston was finished. He had ways of doing that. Men like him always do. She looked up. So I answered your advertisement, she said. Because Wyoming was as far from Boston as I could get, and because you said in your letter that you were a decent man, and because I thought... She stopped herself. What did you think? Ethan asked. She looked at him for a long moment with those quiet reading eyes. I thought that a man who builds something alone and still calls it decent has probably already learned the difference between using people and valuing them. Ethan didn't move, didn't look away. The fire crackled once in the silence between them. Then he said very carefully, You were right about that. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Clara Whitmore let out a breath that had been held too long, and she didn't try to hide it. That night after supper, Ethan stood at the window of his father's old study and looked out at the barn where Duchess stood calm in her stall. He thought about a woman who could quiet a frightened horse without touching it. He thought about a man in Boston who'd tried to turn that into currency. He thought about what it must have cost her to have something rare and real and alive inside her, and to have someone look at it and see only what it was worth. He thought, I know that feeling, not the gift. He had no gift like hers. But the other part, the part where the things you build alone start to feel less like accomplishment and more like evidence. Evidence that no one stayed. Evidence that the silence was what you deserved. He'd built this ranch into something real and good. He ran it well. He was respected in Millhaven in the way a man is respected when he causes no trouble and pays his debts and keeps his word. And he had been completely, thoroughly, comprehensively alone. He turned away from the window. He didn't know yet what Clara Whitmore would become to him. He didn't know what he might become to her. He only knew that she was in his house and she had told him the truth, and Duchess, who had thrown 2 grown men in a week, was sleeping calmly in her stall for the first time in days. That felt like something. He couldn't yet say what, but it felt undeniably like something. And that night in the small upstairs room, where Clara had unpacked her single trunk and arranged her few possessions, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, she sat on the edge of the bed, with her old book in her hands, and did not open it. She thought about the way Ethan had asked his question carefully, directly, without any edge in it. No appetite, no calculation, just a man who needed to understand something and was honest enough to say so. She thought about Boston, about the man whose name she no longer allowed herself to speak even in her own mind. About the morning she'd stood in the street outside the agency office and mailed her answer to a Wyoming advertisement with cold hands and a heart that had for the first time in months felt like it might still have some use left in it. She thought, "He said I was right. Not about the horse. About him." And Clara Whitmore, who had not cried in 6 months, not when she left Boston, not when she sold the last of her mother's jewelry for the train fare. Not once on the long, rattling journey west, pressed her hand flat against the cover of her book and closed her eyes and simply breathed. The Wyoming wind moved against the window. The ranch was quiet, and somewhere below her, a man who had painted his porch rail twice was probably telling himself he wasn't afraid of what came next. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She was up before him again. Ethan heard the kitchen fire catch as he pulled on his boots in the dark, and something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time and didn't quite have a word for, loosened slightly. The sound of another person starting the day. It shouldn't have meant anything. It meant more than he was ready to admit. He came downstairs to find Clara at the stove, and 2 cups already poured, and she slid one toward him, without turning around, without saying good morning, without making anything of it, as if this had been their routine for years instead of 9 days. "There's a storm coming," she said. He wrapped his hands around the cup. "How do you know?" "The horses were restless last night, not spooked, just listening to something." She turned from the stove. "Something's moving in from the north. You'll want the livestock in before noon." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked out the kitchen window at a sky that was clear and bright and gave no indication whatsoever of rain. By 10 o'clock, the clouds had rolled in off the ridge like a gray wall. By noon, it was pouring. Cody, soaked to the skin in the barn doorway, looked at Ethan with an expression that was equal parts impressed and unsettled. "She knew," he said. "She knew this morning." "Get the feed moved to the dry side," Ethan said. "She knew, boss." "Cody." "Right. Feed. Moving it now." The storm kept them indoors for the better part of 2 days. The ranch house, which had always felt too large for one person, became something else entirely with 2 people navigating its rooms and silences. Ethan worked at the table with his ledgers. Clara mended tack and reorganized the supply shelves, and on the second afternoon, pulled a bundle of dried herbs from her trunk and hung them in the kitchen without explaining what they were. He almost asked. He didn't. What he did on the second evening when the rain was hammering the roof and there was nowhere else to be was pour 2 glasses of the whiskey he kept for the kind of night that required it and set one in front of her. She looked at the glass, then at him. "You don't have to drink it," he said. "I know." She picked it up. "I was just trying to remember the last time someone offered me something without wanting something back." The words landed without drama, without self-pity, just fact. She took a sip and looked at the fire, and Ethan sat down across from her and said nothing for a full minute because he was thinking about what a life must look like that makes a person say something like that, as if it's ordinary. "Tell me about the man," he said finally. "In Boston. You don't have to, but I'd like to know." She turned the glass slowly in her hands. "His name was Gerald Holt. His family bred racehorses. Good bloodlines, poor animals, the kind of operation where the horses exist to win, and the winning exists to feed the pride of men who've never worked a day for anything." A pause. "My father introduced us. He thought Gerald was a fine prospect, stable family money, a name people recognized. What did you think?" "I thought he had cold hands and colder eyes, and that his horses flinched when he entered the barn." She said it simply, like a diagnosis. "I married him anyway, because my father asked me to. Because I was 23, and I thought that was what love looked like, doing the thing that hurt you for the sake of someone else's peace." Ethan was very still. "He found out about my gift within a month," Clara continued. "He came home early one afternoon and found me in the stable with his most difficult horse, an animal 3 trainers had given up on. I'd had her calm in 20 minutes. Gerald stood in the doorway and watched the whole thing." She stopped, took a small sip. The look on his face was not wonder. It wasn't even interest. It was arithmetic. He saw money. He saw a system he could own. Her voice stayed level, but Ethan caught the slight tightening around her jaw. He started telling people his horses trained faster because of some method he'd developed. He brought buyers to watch me work, presented it as his technique, never once. She stopped herself, breathed. I told him to stop. He told me I was being ungrateful, that a wife's gifts belonged to the household, that everything I had was already his. The fire popped. Rain drove hard against the window. How long did you stay? Ethan asked. 2 years. She met his eyes across the table. 2 years and 4 months and 11 days. Until the morning he locked the stable and told me I wasn't permitted to work with the horses anymore unless he was present. That I'd been putting ideas in their heads. I remember exactly how he said it. Putting ideas in their heads, and he needed to control the process. Her chin came up slightly. That was the morning I decided I was done. What did you do? I packed one trunk. I took my mother's book, the only thing of hers I had left. I walked out. He told everyone in Boston I'd lost my mind, that I was unstable, dangerous. A slight pause. He was very convincing. He always was. Silence. Ethan turned his glass in his hands, looking at it, and then he said, "He was a fool." "Yes," Clara said. "He was. The tragedy is, it took me 2 years to see it." "It's not a tragedy," Ethan said. "It's a cost. There's a difference. A tragedy is something you can't walk away from." He looked up at her. "You walked away." She stared at him for a moment, with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something in it was surprised. Something in it was almost grateful, though she clearly wasn't comfortable with gratitude. She looked back at the fire. "You're a more careful thinker than you let on," she said. "I don't let on much of anything," he said. "I know." She glanced at him sideways. "It's one of the more reassuring things about you." Bang! The storm broke on the third morning, and with it, something in the atmosphere between them, not resolved, not named, but shifted, like a room after the windows have been opened. The same room, different air. Cody noticed. Of course Cody noticed. He cornered Ethan by the water trough before noon and said with the unearned confidence of a 19-year-old who has never been wrong about anything he's paid attention to, "You like her." "She's my wife," Ethan said. "That's not what I said." "Cody? You listened to her about the storm. You've never listened to anyone about anything. I once told you the east gate latch was going to fail, and you told me it was fine. And 3 days later we spent 4 hours chasing Henderson's cattle off our south pasture. That was different." "How?" Ethan gave him a long, measured look. "Go check the east fence post after the rain." Cody went grinning in a way that Ethan made a point of not seeing. What Ethan hadn't told Clara, what he hadn't told anyone, what he kept in the same locked part of himself, where he put everything that mattered too much, was that the ranch was in trouble. Not ruin. Not yet. But the kind of slow, grinding trouble that doesn't announce itself. 2 bad seasons. A water dispute with the Hargrove operation to the east that had been dragging through the county clerk's office for 14 months without resolution. 3 of his best breeding mares producing below expectation. The ledgers, which he kept with meticulous precision, showing a gap between what he was earning and what he owed that had been widening since spring. He'd convinced himself it was manageable. He was good at convincing himself things were manageable. It was in fact his primary survival skill. But on the 4th morning after the storm, a rider came up from Millhaven carrying a letter from the county seat, and Ethan stood in the yard and read it twice, and then folded it very carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket, and went back to work without changing his expression. Clara watched him do this from the kitchen window. She didn't say anything at breakfast. She didn't say anything through the morning. But at noon, when he came in for water and found her at the table with the household accounts she'd asked quietly 2 days ago if she could look at, she looked up at him and said, "Ethan, the water rights." He put down his cup. "What about them?" "The filing date on the Hargrove dispute. It's in 2 weeks." He looked at her. "How do you know about the Hargrove dispute?" "Mrs. Aldrich at the dry goods store mentioned it when I went into town with Cody on Wednesday." She paused. She mentioned it the way people mention things they think you already know. I didn't correct her assumption. Another pause. What was in the letter this morning? He said nothing. Ethan. It's a ranch problem, he said. I'll handle it. I am part of this ranch. She said it without heat, without drama, but with a precision that made it land harder than raised voice would have. Whatever is in that letter affects both of us. I am not a guest here. I am not a woman you need to protect from the truth of your own life. She held his gaze without blinking. Tell me. He pulled the letter out of his pocket and set it on the table. She read it. He watched her face while she did the slight narrowing of her eyes, the single controlled breath when she reached the bottom. She put it down. They're disputing your original claim, she said. Hargrove's lawyer filed a challenge 3 months ago. The county's giving me 2 weeks to produce the original survey documentation, or they'll rule in Hargrove's favor. He sat down. The documentation is here. I have it. But the survey itself was done by a man named Perkins, and Perkins died last winter, and Hargrove's lawyer is claiming the survey was improperly recorded. Was it? No. His jaw tightened. My father paid for that survey out of the first good cattle sale he ever had. He kept every receipt, every document. I have everything. Then take it to the county seat. I intend to. I'll come with you. He looked up. That's not necessary. Maybe not, Clara said, but I'm coming anyway. She stacked the letters neatly and slid them back toward him. I have very neat handwriting and an excellent memory, and I am considerably more frightening than I look. You could use both of those things in a county clerk's office. He stared at her for a moment, and then quietly, unexpectedly, in a way that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her, he laughed. Not a polite sound. An actual laugh, short and real, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether you mean it. Clara's expression shifted, startled at first, then something softer, something that warmed her face from the inside, without her quite meaning it to. All right, he said. Good, she said, and pulled the accounts back toward her. Okay. It was Cody who brought the news that changed everything. He came back from town on a Friday afternoon, and Ethan knew immediately that something was wrong, because Cody was 19 and could not hide a feeling to save his life. And the expression he came in wearing was the specific combination of alarmed and reluctant that meant he had something to say and didn't want to say it. Just say it, Ethan said without looking up from the fence post he was setting. Cody got off his horse, stood there, said, There's a man asking about Clara in Millhaven. The post went in crooked. Ethan straightened it manually, not looking at Cody. What kind of man? Well-dressed, Eastern. Came in on the afternoon coach, started asking at the hotel about whether there was a woman named Clara Whitmore or Clara Holt living out at the McAllister Ranch. Cody hesitated. Sheriff Danner heard about it and told me when I was at the feed store. He said the man's name is Harold Finch, said he's some kind of lawyer. Ethan set down his tools. Did this Finch say who sent him? No. Cody met his eyes. But Boss Holt. The name he used was Holt. Ethan walked past him toward the house. He found Clara in the kitchen, and she knew before he said a word. He could see it in the way she went still when she looked at his face, the way her hand stopped moving over the dough she'd been working. Someone's come from Boston, he said. The color left her face. Not dramatically, she wasn't a dramatic woman, but he watched it go, watched her straighten her spine against it, the way she did everything with that iron, quiet discipline of hers. A lawyer, she said. It wasn't a question. Name of Finch. She looked at the table. Her hands were still. Gerald has very long arms, she said quietly. I should have known. What does he want? I don't know. She looked up. But Gerald Holt does not spend money on lawyers for sentimental reasons. He wants something. He's always wanted something. She pressed her lips together. The question is what he thinks he can take from here. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the table, and he looked at her steadily, and he said the thing he meant completely. Nothing. He can't take anything from here. She looked at him. Something in her expression flickered, not relief, not yet, but the possibility of it. "You don't know what he's capable of," she said. "Maybe not, but he doesn't know what I'm capable of either." He held her gaze. "This is your home, Clara. Whatever that man came here for, he's going to leave without it. I'm telling you that as a fact, not a comfort." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that was very steady and very low, "He may have filed papers, claiming I'm still his wife, that the agency marriage was invalid." Ethan felt the words land in his chest like something physical. He kept his face still. "Are you?" he asked. "Still his wife by law?" "I don't know," she said. "I left. I signed nothing." He may have obtained an annulment on grounds of mental instability, which was the story he told. Or he may have done nothing at all and let the legal ambiguity sit there, waiting to be useful. She finally looked directly at him, and her eyes were clear and steady and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I should have told you this before you agreed to the marriage. I know that. I should have—" "Stop," Ethan said. She stopped. "You told me there were things that were hard to explain," he said. "I accepted that. I still accept it." He paused. "But I need to know everything now. Whatever Finch knows, I need to know first. You understand?" "Yes." "Then tell me." She told him. She told him all of it, not the version she'd edited for safety, not the version she'd kept small and manageable, but all of it. The marriage in Boston, the 2 years the horses Gerald's operation, and the men he employed, and the debts he'd used to control people around him. She told him about the morning she left, about the servant girl who'd helped her pack in secret, about the way Gerald had stood in the doorway of his study, watching her walk down the front path, and had said nothing, just watched, which was worse. She told him what she suspected, that Gerald Holt did not want her back. He wanted leverage. He wanted something, the gift, the horses, some commercial arrangement he could claim as his right under a marriage contract that may or may not still stand. Ethan listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the low sound of the fire. He said, "Is there anything else?" "No," she said. "That's all of it." He nodded once. Then he stood up, crossed to the door, opened it, and called out into the yard, "Cody." Cody appeared immediately, which meant he'd been standing closer than he should have. Ethan didn't address that. "Ride back to town," Ethan said. "Tell Sheriff Danner I'd like a word with him at his earliest convenience, and tell him there's a man named Finch at the hotel who's going to need to understand that Wyoming is not Boston." Cody looked from Ethan to the open kitchen doorway and back. "Yes, sir," he said, and for once in his life said nothing else. After Cody left, after the sound of hoofbeats faded down the road, Clara stood up from the table and carried her coffee cup to the window. She stood with her back to Ethan, looking out at the yard, where the evening light was coming in long and golden, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You didn't ask me if it was worth it, coming here, whether I'd make the same choice knowing what I know." Ethan moved to stand a few feet behind her. "Would you?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the yard, at the barn, at the fence line running west where Duchess was visible through the slats, grazing slow and calm. "Gerald used to say that I was difficult to love," Clara said quietly. "He said it like a verdict, like he'd done the math and arrived at a conclusion that couldn't be argued with." She turned from the window, not to face Ethan, just away from the glass. "I spent a long time believing him." Ethan said nothing. He waited. "I don't believe him anymore," she said. It came out simple and direct, the way she said everything that mattered most. "I stopped believing him the morning you asked me, without any performance, without any strategy, just asked me to tell you the truth. And you listened to all of it." She paused. "That was the first time in a very long time that I felt like a person and not a problem to be solved." The words sat between them. Ethan did not trust himself to say the right thing, so he said the true thing instead. "You are not a problem, Clara. You are the most competent, clear-eyed, quietly remarkable person who has ever sat at my kitchen table. And I will not let a man from Boston come here and take one thing from you. Not one." She looked at him then. Really looked. And whatever she found in his face, whatever she was reading, the way she read the horses, the way she read the weather, that deep instinctive reading that missed nothing. Whatever she found there made something in her expression change, not soften, settle, like something coming to rest after a long time in motion. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. Outside, the evening was going to blue, and somewhere down the road toward Millhaven, Cody was riding fast, and somewhere in a hotel room, a man named Finch was sitting with papers he intended to use as a weapon. He had no idea what he'd ridden into. And Clara Whitmore, who had packed one trunk and traveled 2,000 miles and walked into a stranger's life and started a fire and hung her herbs in the kitchen window and stood in a pasture with a rearing horse and told the truth at every turn. Clara pressed her hand once against the window glass and looked at the land that was against all reasonable expectation, beginning to feel like hers. The fight was coming. She had stopped being afraid of it. Sheriff Walt Danner arrived the next morning before the coffee was done. He was a broad, unhurried man in his late 50s who had been sheriff of Millhaven County for 22 years and had developed over those decades the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have seen enough trouble to stop being surprised by it. He tied his horse at the post, took the coffee Clara offered him without ceremony, drank it standing up, and said, "Finch is still at the hotel. Told the desk clerk he plans to stay a week." "A week," Ethan said. "Bought a new pair of boots at Henderson's yesterday. Man's not in a hurry." Danner looked at Clara. "He asked around about you, Mrs. McAllister. Used both names, Whitmore and Holt. Asked whether the marriage at the agency had been properly filed. Asked whether you'd arrived with any legal documentation." Clara's hands were steady around her cup. "What did people say?" "People said the McAllister ranch is none of their business." Danner allowed himself a small, satisfied expression. "This is Wyoming, not a Boston parlor. People here tend to find lawyers irritating on general principle." He set his cup down on the table. "But Mrs. McAllister Finch is carrying papers. I had Deputy Reeves take a look at the hotel register and listen at the hall for a bit. He's got a document case with him that he locks in the hotel safe every night. Whatever he's got in there, he came a long way to use it." "What kind of papers?" Ethan asked. "That," Danner said, "is what I came to ask her." Clara put down her cup. She looked at the table for a moment the way she did when she was sorting through something internally, not hesitating, just organizing. Then she looked up at Danner directly. "Gerald Holt may have filed for an annulment on grounds of desertion," she said. "Or he may have obtained one and then attempted to have our agency marriage invalidated on the basis that I was still legally his wife when I filed with the agency." She paused. "If he was successful, then legally my marriage to Ethan doesn't exist." Danner looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Clara. "That's the worst case," Clara continued. "The other possibility is that he didn't file anything, that he's using the legal ambiguity as leverage without actually having resolved it, which would mean Finch is here to negotiate, not to serve papers." "Which do you think it is?" Danner asked. "Gerald doesn't negotiate unless he has to," she said. "He prefers certainty. He prefers to arrive with something already decided and simply inform people of the outcome." Her jaw tightened. "He thinks it's more efficient." Danner was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ethan. "You got a lawyer, Ethan? I know a man in Cheyenne. Get him on the wire today." He picked up his hat. "And Mrs. McAllister, don't go into town alone until this is settled. I'm not saying Finch is dangerous, but men who work for dangerous men tend to pick up the habits." He left. The sound of his horse faded down the road. The kitchen was very quiet. Cody, who had been leaning against the doorframe throughout the entire conversation, trying to look like he wasn't listening, said, "What do we do?" "You," Ethan said, "are going to ride to the telegraph office and wire Robert Ashby in Cheyenne. Tell him I need him here by Thursday, and tell him it's urgent." He turned to Clara. "And you are going to write down everything. Every date, every document, every conversation you can remember from Boston, Everything you signed, everything you didn't sign. Start from the beginning." "I know what to write," she said. "I know you do." He met her eyes. "I'm saying it because I want you to know that every word of it matters. We are not going to let this come apart on a detail." Something moved in her expression. She reached across the table and picked up the pen that was sitting beside the household accounts. She started writing. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. Ethan watched her from the doorway for a minute. That straight spine, that precise hand, that absolute focus. And then he went out to the barn, because watching her felt too much like something he didn't have a name for yet, and he needed to work. He found Duchess waiting at her stall door. The mare had been different since Clara. Quieter, steadier, with none of the nervous sideways energy that had made her unpredictable for months. Ethan ran his hand along her jaw and thought about what Clara had said. "I can hear what they're feeling." He tried to imagine it carrying the fear and confusion of every creature you walked past, reading them the way other people read faces. He tried to imagine doing that for years without anyone knowing, without anyone thinking it was anything other than strange. He thought about Gerald Holt standing in that stable doorway watching his wife calm an impossible horse and seeing profit. His hand on Duchess's jaw went still. He had never in his life wanted to hit a man he hadn't met before. He was reconsidering that record now. Cody came back from the telegraph office with 2 things confirmation that Robert Ashby would arrive Thursday morning and a piece of information that shifted everything. "Finch went to see Hargrove," Cody said. He was breathing a little fast the way he breathed when something had alarmed him. "Ed Cawley saw them together at the land office this morning. Finch and Wallace Hargrove going through documents side by side at the county clerk's counter." Ethan went very still. Together. Together. Clara appeared in the barn doorway. She'd heard. "Hargrove and Finch," she said slowly. "The water rights dispute, and the marriage question." She looked at Ethan. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Ethan said. "It isn't." The shape of it was becoming clear now, and it was worse than Ethan had thought. Not 2 separate problems arriving at the same time, but one coordinated problem arriving from 2 directions. Hargrove wanted the water rights to the eastern creek that ran through the McAllister property. Holt, through Finch, wanted Clara. If the marriage could be invalidated, Clara had no legal standing on the ranch. If Ethan lost the water rights case simultaneously, the ranch itself would be weakened, possibly unsustainable. 2 pressure points. Applied at once. "Someone introduced them," Clara said. "Or someone arranged the whole thing." Ethan looked at her. "How well connected is Gerald Holt?" "Well enough." Her voice was steady, but her eyes had gone cold in a particular way, not frightened, but focused. The way eyes go when a person has been underestimated once too often, and has decided quietly and completely to stop tolerating it. "He has business contacts in Chicago, Denver, several in the cattle trade." He could have heard about the Hargrove dispute through any number of channels. She paused. "He's been watching Ethan. He knew where I went. He's been patient about it." "Why?" "Because patience is the one form of cruelty that doesn't leave marks," she said flatly. Cody, standing between them, looked from one to the other and said, "What do we do?" Ethan said, "We don't wait for Thursday." He rode into Millhaven that afternoon with Clara beside him and Cody half a length back, and he went directly to the hotel. Finch was in the dining room. He was exactly what Ethan had expected, mid-40s, well-dressed in the Eastern way, with soft hands and careful eyes that moved to Clara the instant they walked in and stayed there with the practiced neutrality of a man who hides his reactions for a living. Ethan pulled out a chair across from him and sat down. Clara sat beside him. Cody stayed at the door. "Mr. Finch," Ethan said. "Mr. McAllister." Finch's voice was measured, polished. "Mrs. Well, that's rather the question, isn't it?" "Her name is Mrs. McAllister," Ethan said. "That's settled. I'm afraid it may not be quite as settled as you'd like." Finch reached into the leather case at his elbow. My client, Mr. Gerald Holt of Boston, obtained a legal annulment of his marriage to Clara Whitmore on the grounds of abandonment and mental incapacity filed in the Massachusetts courts 14 months ago. He laid a document on the table. As Miss Whitmore was a resident of Massachusetts at the time of filing and remained so under law, the Massachusetts court had jurisdiction. The annulment is legal and binding. Clara looked at the document without touching it. Mental incapacity, she said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. That is what he filed. It's a legal term, not a, I know what it is, she said. I know exactly what it is and exactly why he chose it. She looked up from the document to Finch's face. It means that nothing I signed, agreed to, or decided can be held as valid, including leaving him, including coming here, including this marriage. She paused. It's very efficient, isn't it? One filing and a woman ceases to exist as a legal person. Finch had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. Miss Whitmore. Mrs. McAllister, Ethan said again. His voice had not changed. He had not moved. But there was something in the stillness of him now that made Finch stop talking and reassess. My client is prepared to be reasonable, Finch said, shifting direction. He does not necessarily require Miss Whitmore's return to Boston. He is, however, requesting— What does he want? Clara said. A formal agreement. That you would, in an advisory capacity, provide consultation services to the Holt breeding operation, remotely through correspondence, documentation of your methods, a signed statement acknowledging that the techniques you developed were created during the period of the Holt marriage and are therefore— No, Clara said. Finch blinked. Miss— No. She said it the same way she'd said everything that mattered, without heat, without drama, with the absolute finality of a woman who has already done her grieving and come out the other side. My methods are mine. They were mine before Gerald Holt, and they were mine during Gerald Holt, and they are mine now. He owns nothing of me. Not my name, not my work, not my years, and certainly not whatever it is I can do that he wants to package and sell. She pushed the document back across the table. Take that back to Boston. Finch picked up the document. He looked at Ethan. Mr. McAllister, surely you understand the legal position here. Your marriage. My attorney arrives Thursday, Ethan said. Robert Ashby out of Cheyenne. You may be familiar with him. He's argued 3 cases before the Wyoming Territorial Court in the last 2 years and won all 3. He leaned forward slightly. And when he arrives, the first thing he's going to do is look very carefully at the connection between Gerald Holt's filing and Wallace Hargrove's water rights challenge. Because a lawyer from Boston walking into a county clerk's office alongside a local land operator is not a coincidence. It's a strategy. And strategies leave tracks. Finch's expression did not change, but his hands, Ethan noticed, had gone very still on the table. I don't know what you think you know, Finch said carefully. I know enough, Ethan said, and by Thursday I'll know more. He stood up. Clara stood with him. Enjoy Mill Haven, Mr. Finch, Ethan said. The hotel makes a decent breakfast. They walked out. On the street, Cody fell into step beside them and said under his breath, That was the most terrifying thing I've ever watched, and nothing even happened. Something happened, Clara said quietly. What? He knows we know, she said. That changes what he does next. Cody looked at Ethan. Is that good or bad? Depends on what he does next, Ethan said. What Finch did next was visit the land office alone and spend 2 hours with the county recorder. Deputy Reeves watched from across the street and reported back that afternoon Finch had been reviewing the original McAllister survey documentation, the same documentation Ethan had been ordered to produce for the water rights hearing. Clara heard this and sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for a full minute. Then she said, He's going to challenge the survey. Ethan looked at her. Hargrove is challenging the survey. Hargrove can't. Hargrove doesn't have standing unless he can prove the original filing was defective. She looked up. But Holt's lawyer, working on behalf of a claim that I'm still a legal resident of Massachusetts, and therefore my presence on this property is legally complicated. Finch could potentially argue that the marriage arrangement itself introduced a defect into the property claim. She pressed her fingers against the table. It's not solid law, but it doesn't need to be solid. It just needs to be enough confusion to delay the hearing, and if the hearing is delayed past the water usage season. The East Creek goes dry by August, Ethan said. He heard his own voice say it with a flatness that wasn't composure. It was the sound a man makes when something hits him in a place he didn't know was exposed. They don't need to win, Clara said. They just need to run out the clock. The kitchen was quiet. Cody, who had been listening from the doorway again, said, "Is it too late to move the ranch to Colorado?" Neither of them answered. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch step in the dark, the same step he'd repainted twice, not that it mattered now, and looked at the stars and tried to think clearly about a situation that kept acquiring new edges every time he thought he'd found the shape of it. The porch door opened behind him. Clara sat down on the step beside him, without being asked, without announcing herself with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She had a blanket over her shoulders against the night cold. They sat in silence for a while. Then she said, "I'm sorry." "Don't," he said. "Ethan." "I said don't." He looked at her. "You didn't bring this. He followed you. There's a difference, and I need you to understand I know the difference." She was quiet. "What I'm trying to work out," he said, "is how a man gets to be like that. Gets to the point where another person is a resource to be deployed." He looked back at the sky. "I've known men who used land that way. Strip it, leave it, move on. Never met one who did it with a person quite so deliberately." "They exist," Clara said. "More than you'd think. They learn early that everything has a use, and the only question is whether you've found it yet." She pulled the blanket tighter. "Gerald found my use quickly. He was very efficient about it. I think that's what I mistook for intelligence." "He's not intelligent. He's clever. There's a difference. Clever men find the fastest route to what they want. Intelligent men occasionally ask whether what they want is worth the route." A pause. "Gerald never asked." Ethan turned to look at her. In the dark, with the blanket around her shoulders and her hair loose from its pins, she'd been getting ready for bed when she'd heard him go out. He realized she looked less armored than usual. Not different, just more visible. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been asking me things since the night of the storm," she said. "I haven't stopped you yet. Were you ever happy in Boston? Before all of it?" She thought about it genuinely, which he'd come to understand was what she always did, never reached for. The comfortable answer, always went and found the true one. "There were horses," she said, "and there were books, and there were mornings when the city was quiet enough that I could hear it breathing, and I liked that." She paused. "But happy is a bigger word than any of that. I don't think I was happy. I think I was managed. I was very good at convincing myself that managed was the same thing. And now?" She looked at him. He held his ground. He'd asked the question and he meant it, and she knew he meant it, and they both knew it. "Now," she said slowly, "there are mornings when I come downstairs and the fire is already going, because you started it before I woke, which you've been doing for a week and pretending you didn't, and the coffee is made, and there's a horse in the barn who lets me put my head against her neck, and the land goes on forever in every direction, and I think—" She stopped. "What do you think?" he said. "I think this is what the real thing feels like," she said quietly, "and I am trying very hard not to be afraid of it." The admission cost her something. He could see it, the slight set of her jaw, the discipline it took to say something that real, without armoring it. She was not a woman who gave vulnerability easily. She'd had it used against her. She'd learned to ration it like water in a dry season. He said, "I'm trying not to be afraid of it either." She looked at him. "I'm not very good at this," he said. "The talking, the all of it. I've been alone a long time, and I built a whole life around not needing to be good at it." He looked at his hands. "But I notice things. I noticed the first night that you moved through this house like it was already yours. I noticed that Duchess trusts you more than she's ever trusted me, and I've had her 4 years. I notice—" He stopped, organized, started again. "I notice that when you're not in the room is different. It was never different before. It was just a room." Clara was very still beside him. "I don't know what to do with that yet," he said. "I'm telling you I notice it. That's all I've got right now." A long moment of silence. Then she said, "That's enough," and she didn't move away. And neither did he. And they sat on the repainted porch step in the dark Wyoming night, with their shoulders almost touching, and the stars going on above them, and neither of them said anything else, and it was without question the most honest either of them had been in years. Gawk. Ashby arrived Wednesday evening a day early, which told Ethan that his wire had alarmed the lawyer enough to move fast. Robert Ashby was a compact, sharp-eyed man of 50, with ink-stained fingers and the manner of someone who has spent 3 decades eating arguments for breakfast and found them nutritious. He sat at the kitchen table, spread Ethan's documents across it, read Clara's written account of the Boston marriage from first page to last without comment, and then sat back and looked at both of them over his reading glasses. "The annulment is real," he said first. Clara didn't react. Massachusetts court had jurisdiction. The grounds of abandonment are technically applicable under their law, and the mental incapacity claim is— He paused. Distasteful, but not necessarily invalid under the statute they used. He looked at Clara. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said. "Tell me what it means." "It means your agency marriage to Mr. McAllister filed, while the annulment was already in the Massachusetts court record, is legally questionable. It may be voidable." He held up one hand before Ethan could speak. "Maybe. Not is. Because there are 2 questions Finch has not addressed and probably hopes we won't notice." He picked up one of the documents. First, the mental incapacity filing. For that filing to stand there must be supporting documentation, a physician's statement, a sworn affidavit, something establishing the legal basis. I want that documentation. Because if Gerald Holt obtained it fraudulently, if there is no legitimate physician's statement, or if the one he used was obtained under false pretense, the entire annulment is void. "How do we get it?" Ethan asked. "I have a colleague in Boston who specializes in exactly this kind of filing. I'll wire him tonight. He can have the court documents pulled within 48 hours. Ashby made a note. "Second question, Finch. He's been talking to Hargrove. I need to know whether that connection is formal, whether Holt has a legal or financial relationship with Hargrove, because if he does, we have a case for coordinated interference with a property claim, which is not something the Wyoming Territorial Court looks kindly on." He looked up. "Do either of you have any idea how those 2 men might know each other?" Silence. And then Clara said, "The Denver Cattle Exchange, 3 years ago. Gerald attended. He was expanding the racing operation, looking at working stock. I went with him. Wallace Hargrove was there." She said it slowly, pulling it out of memory with the same precision she applied to everything. "They spoke at dinner. I don't know what was said. I was at the other end of the table." She looked at Ethan. "But I remember Gerald's face when they were introduced. He had a specific expression he used when he met someone he thought might be useful." Ashby wrote it down. "That's a thread," he said. "Thin, but a thread. We pull it." "When's the water rights hearing?" Ethan asked. 14 days. Ashby set down his pen. "That is tight, very tight, but it's workable if Boston moves fast." He looked at Clara. "Mrs. McAllister." "Use the name," Ethan said quietly. Ashby looked at him, then nodded once. "Mrs. McAllister, I want you to understand that the annulment, even if it stands, does not necessarily invalidate this marriage. Wyoming territorial law has provisions for good faith marriages contracted without full legal knowledge. Given your circumstances, a forced departure from Boston, fraudulent grounds for the incapacity claim, a new life established in good faith, A territorial judge may look at this very differently than a Massachusetts court. May, Clara said. May, Ashby repeated. I won't promise you more than that. She looked at him steadily. I don't need promises. I need the truth and a plan. Ashby almost smiled. Then we understand each other perfectly. Zag. After Ashby had retired to the spare room and Cody had gone to the bunkhouse, Ethan found Clara standing in the kitchen with the lamp low and her hand flat on the table the way she did sometimes when she was processing something so large she needed the physical anchor of something solid beneath her palm. He stood in the doorway and said nothing. She said without turning, If the annulment stands and the marriage is voided, I have no legal standing here. I'm a guest on your property, an unmarried woman living in your house which would... She stopped. People would talk. And in a county where you're already in a legal dispute, that kind of talk is a weapon. Let them talk, he said. Ethan, Clara. He crossed the kitchen. He stood beside her close enough that she turned to look at him. I hired a lawyer. I'm going to fight this in every court that will hear it. But I need you to understand something that is separate from all of that. He looked at her directly. Whether this marriage is legal or not, I know what it is. I know what you are to me, and that is not a thing a court document creates or destroys. She looked up at him. I'm not asking you to take that on faith, he said. I know what asking someone to take things on faith has cost you. I'm just telling you where I stand. You can decide what to do with it. Her hand on the table turned over, slowly, deliberately, palm up. He looked down at it. He put his hand in hers. She closed her fingers around it and didn't let go. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and dark and full of stars. And somewhere in a hotel room in Millhaven, a lawyer named Finch was sitting with a document he believed was his best weapon, having no idea that the man he was up against had just decided quietly, completely without reservation, exactly what he was willing to lose everything to protect. Not the ranch, not the water rights, her. The wire from Boston came on Friday morning, and it changed everything. Ashby read it twice at the kitchen table, then set it down without a word, and poured himself more coffee, which told Ethan, who had known Robert Ashby for 11 years, and understood that the man only reached for his cup when he needed a moment to think that the news was significant. Tell me, Ethan said. Ashby looked at Clara first. My colleague pulled the court filing in Boston. The mental incapacity annulment was supported by a physician's affidavit, a Dr. Clement Ward practice on Beacon Hill. He paused. Dr. Ward died 8 months ago. That could mean anything, Clara said carefully. It could. Except my colleague also spoke to Dr. Ward's former nurse, a woman named Mrs. Fitch, who is 72 years old, has no patience for dishonesty, and kept copies of every patient file that passed through that office for 40 years. Ashby picked up the wire again. Clara Whitmore was never a patient of Dr. Clement Ward. She never visited his office. He never examined her, never interviewed her, never had any contact with her whatsoever. He set the wire down. The affidavit is a forgery. The kitchen went completely quiet. Clara put both hands flat on the table. He forged it, she said. Not a question, not shock. Just the sound of a woman confirming something she'd always known was possible, arriving at the proof of it, and feeling the specific exhaustion of being right about a thing she'd hoped to be wrong about. The signature my colleague believes was traced from a legitimate Ward document, likely a letter or receipt, Holt obtained through some business connection. It's well done. Good enough to pass a routine Massachusetts court review. Ashby looked up over his glasses. But it will not survive a formal challenge. Not with Mrs. Fitch's testimony and the complete absence of any patient record. The annulment is void, Ethan said. The annulment is void, Ashby confirmed. Which means your marriage is uncontested, which means Finch has nothing. He folded the wire carefully. But here is where I need you both to be very clear-headed. Holt committed fraud on a Massachusetts court. That is a serious matter with serious consequences. However, the moment we make that fraud public, Holt will know his position has collapsed. And men who know their position has collapsed tend to do one of two things. Retreat or escalate, Clara said. Exactly. Ashby looked at her with the expression of a man who has just confirmed a favorable assessment. "Given what you've told me about Gerald Holt, which do you believe he'll do?" She answered without hesitation. "He'll escalate. He'll instruct Finch to move on the water rights immediately. He doesn't like to leave without drawing blood somewhere." Ashby nodded. "That's what I thought. So we have a choice. We reveal the fraud now through proper channels and watch Finch make a desperate move on the water rights with whatever he has left. Or..." He paused. "We wait. We walk into that water rights hearing in 12 days with everything ready, and we expose both the fraud and the Hargrove connection simultaneously in front of the county judge, where it does the most damage to both of them at once." Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Ethan. "We wait," they said at the same moment. Ashby almost smiled. "Then we have 12 days to build the case." My, those 12 days were the hardest and strangest of Ethan's life, and he had once spent 3 days pinned in a collapsed mine shaft during a survey job at 24, so that was saying something. He worked the ranch through the daylight hours with the grinding focus of a man who needs his hands moving in order to think. Cody worked beside him without being asked to stay close, without saying much, just present, in the way that 19-year-olds can be present when they've decided someone matters to them and they don't know any other way to show it. Clara managed the household, managed the correspondence with Ashby, managed the careful accounting of every document and date and name she could pull from memory. She was methodical and thorough, and she did not fall apart not once, not even on the morning Finch rode past the ranch road and stopped his horse at the gate for a full minute, just stopped and looked at the house before turning back toward town. Ethan saw it from the fence line. He watched Finch ride away and felt something cold move through him that was not fear. It was closer to the feeling a man gets when he sees a storm on the horizon and knows he has done everything possible to prepare, and also knows that preparing is not the same as controlling. That night he told Clara what he'd seen. She nodded, said, "He's measuring what he has left." Is he the kind of man who walks away when the math doesn't work? She thought about it. Finch himself probably yes. He's a lawyer, not a fanatic. But Gerald doesn't pay men to walk away. He pays them to find a different door. "Then we watch for the different door," Ethan said. The different door came from a direction none of them had anticipated. It was Cody who found it on the 9th day entirely by accident because Cody was 19 and could not walk past a conversation without listening to it. And he'd been at the Millhaven feed store when 2 of Hargrove's ranch hands came in arguing about something they stopped arguing about the moment they noticed him. He told Ethan that evening, working hard to keep his voice steady. They were talking about water, about the creek, the East Creek, your East Creek. One of them said something about a diversion being ready. The other one told him to shut up. He looked at Ethan. "Boss, I think Hargrove's been building a water diversion above the survey line, if he gets it operational before the hearing." Ethan was already moving. He found Ashby in the sitting room, told him. Ashby set down his papers and said 3 words, "Show me where." They rode out before dark, Ethan, Ashby, and Cody, to the eastern boundary, following the creek line north toward the ridge where the Hargrove property began. And there it was. Not finished. Not operational yet. But the work was clear: diverted channel, reinforced banks, a sluice gate that wasn't in place yet, but had the brackets for it freshly cut into the stone. Ashby stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "He was never going to win the hearing. He knew that. This was always the real plan: delay the hearing long enough to get this operational, divert the water before any court ruling, and then argue that the water had already been flowing through Hargrove land for a season, and therefore established use applied." "Can he do that?" Cody asked. "Not legally," Ashby said. "But legally is only half of what matters in a water dispute. The other half is physical reality. If that creek runs dry on the McAllister property before the hearing, the damage is done, whether the court rules for him or not." He looked at Ethan. "How long before this is operational?" Ethan studied the construction, calculated. 3 days, maybe 4. The hearing is in 3 days. They looked at each other. "We need to move the hearing up," Ethan said. "I know." Ashby was already turning his horse. "I need to be in front of Judge Calloway before morning." Ashby rode to the county seat that night. Ethan came home to find Clara awake at the kitchen table. She'd known something had happened the moment she heard the horses come back without Ashby, and he told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, "He panicked. Hargrove panicked. The diversion was never supposed to be visible. He was building it slowly, carefully to be done before anyone looked. But when Finch told him the fraud case was shakier than expected, he pushed the timeline." "That means they know we're building something," Ethan said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Which means tomorrow is going to be worse before it gets better." She was right. Freund. The next morning, Gerald Holt arrived in Millhaven. Not through a lawyer, not through a wire. In person on the 9 o'clock coach from Cheyenne, dressed in a charcoal suit, and carrying himself with the easy practiced authority of a man who walks into rooms and expects them to reorganize around him. Ethan heard about it from Sheriff Danner before 10 o'clock. He did not tell Clara immediately. He needed 20 minutes. First, 20 minutes of absolutely nothing but standing in the barn with his hand on Duchess's neck, breathing evenly, making himself think instead of react. Gerald Holt was here. The man who had forged a physician's signature. The man who had used a woman's gift against her like a tool. The man who had spent 2 years making Clara believe that managed and loved were the same thing, and then spent 14 months making sure she had nowhere to run to. That man had gotten off a coach in Millhaven, Wyoming, and Ethan McAllister was going to have to be very, very careful about what he did next. He went back inside. He told Clara. She went completely still. Not the stillness of fear, he knew her well enough now to know the difference. This was the stillness of a woman reaching down to the bottom of herself and finding out what's there. It lasted about 10 seconds. Then she said, "He came himself because the lawyer failed. He thinks his presence will change the calculation." "Will it?" She looked at him. "Not for me, not anymore." She stood up. "But I want to be there, Ethan. Whatever happens, the hearing, the confrontation, all of it. I am not staying here while my life gets decided in a room I'm not in." "I know," he said. "I wasn't going to ask you to." Something moved through her face, quick warm gone before she let it settle. She nodded once. "Then let's go." They were crossing the main street of Millhaven when Gerald Holt stepped out of the hotel. Ethan felt Clara go rigid beside him. Not a flinch, a recognition. Like a body identifying a threat it already knows by instinct. Holt saw her. His expression did not change visibly, but his pace altered something in the deliberateness of it, and he crossed the street toward them with the air of a man arriving at a meeting he'd arranged. He was older than Ethan had imagined. Heavier. He had a face that had once been handsome, and now wore its handsomeness like a credential going slightly out of date. His eyes, when they landed on Clara, were the coldest thing Ethan had seen in a long time. And they were cold in the specific way that told you the coldness was chosen, maintained a tool like anything else. "Clara," he said. Not hello. Just her name like ownership. "Gerald," she said. Her voice was steady as a rock shelf. His eyes moved to Ethan, a very brief assessment, the kind of look that prices things. "Mr. McAllister, I'd hoped we could handle this through counsel." "We did," Ethan said. "Your counsel appears to have run out of useful things to say." Holt's expression didn't shift. "My wife is standing next to me," Ethan said. "Her name is Clara McAllister. Anything you'd like to say to her you can say in front of me. Any legal matter you'd like to raise, you can raise in front of Judge Calloway, who has moved our water rights hearing to tomorrow morning, and will also be receiving a full account of the forged physician's affidavit that formed the basis of your Massachusetts annulment filing." The briefest pause. So brief a less careful person wouldn't have caught it. "That's a serious accusation," Holt said. "It's a documented fact," Ethan said. "Mrs. Fitch sends her regards." Something crossed Holt's face then. Not guilt, not remorse, but the particular expression of a chess player who has just watched his opponent take a piece he didn't know was in play. He looked from Ethan to Clara. Clara said nothing. She simply looked at him. And the look she gave him was not anger, not hatred, not triumph. It was something far more devastating than any of those. It was clarity. The look of a woman who finally fully with no remaining doubt sees the person in front of her for exactly what they are, and finds it far smaller than she'd feared. "You forged a document," she said quietly. "In the name of a dead man, to bury me legally so I couldn't refuse you." She paused. "I want you to understand that I'm not surprised. I want you to understand that I looked for it in you before I left, and I already knew it was there. I just couldn't prove it." Another pause. "Now I can." Holt said nothing. "Go home, Gerald," she said. "Go home and deal with what you've built for yourself. But understand that nothing, not a lawyer, not a filing, not every connection you have in Boston is going to reach this far again. I promise you that." She turned away from him. So did Ethan. They walked down the street toward Ashby's temporary office without looking back. Behind them, Gerald Holt stood on the Millhaven street and watched them go. And Cody, who had been watching from the feed store doorway, said later that the man stood there for a full 2 minutes before he went back inside the hotel, and that the expression on his face during those 2 minutes was one Cody couldn't fully describe, except that it looked like a man realizing he'd already lost, and that the losing had been his own doing. The hearing was moved. Ashby confirmed it that afternoon. Judge Horace Calloway, 23 years on the territorial bench as patient as geology, and twice as immovable, had agreed to hear the McAllister water rights case the following morning, with the Hargrove diversion site, as evidence of interference with property rights during active litigation. Holt's lawyer, a Cheyenne attorney named Baxter, who Holt had apparently retained to supplement Finch, filed a motion that evening to delay the hearing on grounds that the McAllister marriage documentation was under challenge. Ashby filed a counter-motion within the hour, citing the Massachusetts fraud and attaching Mrs. Fitch's sworn statement, which Ashby's Boston colleague had obtained and wired in full. Judge Calloway denied the delay motion before dinner. Finch Ethan heard from Danner packed his document case that same evening. He was on the morning coach east before the hearing began. The hearing itself lasted 4 hours. Ashby presented the original survey documentation, every page, every receipt, every record Ethan's father had kept in a cedar box under the study floorboards. He presented the independent survey Ashby had commissioned over the past week from a licensed Wyoming territorial surveyor. He presented photographs of the Hargrove diversion site taken by Deputy Reeves at Danner's instruction, showing the construction dated by the new lumber and fresh-cut stone. Hargrove's attorney argued that the diversion was lawful improvement of Hargrove's own land. Ashby asked with the precise and cheerful relentlessness of a man who genuinely enjoys this part of his work, why the diversion was built pointing directly at the McAllister Creek line rather than toward the Hargrove water table, and why the construction had been undertaken during an active water rights litigation without notification to the court. Hargrove's attorney had very little to say to that. When Judge Calloway recessed for his deliberation, Ethan sat beside Clara on the hard courtroom bench and didn't move. Neither did she. They sat with their shoulders touching, not speaking, not performing composure, just steady, the way two people are steady when they've decided something together and the deciding is done. Cody sat behind them and bounced his knee against the bench leg for 45 minutes until Clara reached back and put her hand firmly on his knee without turning around, and he stopped immediately and looked slightly ashamed of himself. "Sorry," he whispered. "It's fine," she whispered back. Judge Calloway returned. He ruled in full for the McAllister Ranch on the water rights. He ordered the Hargrove diversion dismantled within 30 days at Hargrove's expense. He referred the matter of the diversion's construction during active litigation to the county prosecutor for review of potential contempt charges. He then looked over the courtroom and said in the deliberate carrying voice of a man who has spent 23 years making sure people understand him the first time, "I have also reviewed the documentation pertaining to the McAllister marriage and the Massachusetts annulment matter. The annulment predicated on a fraudulent physician's affidavit is without legal force in this territory. The marriage between Ethan McAllister and Clara McAllister is valid binding and recognized in full by this court. Any further legal challenge to that marriage originating from the Holt matter in Massachusetts will be referred to the Territorial Attorney General." He looked up from his papers. "We're done here." Ashby closed his briefcase. Cody made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob, and was completely unself-conscious. Clara sat still for one moment. Then she put her face in her hands. Not weeping, not breaking, just covering herself for a single private second, the way a person does when something has been held at arm's length for so long that putting it down finally takes every bit of the strength that holding it took. Ethan put his hand on her back. She didn't lean into it. She didn't need to. She just let it be there, and after that one private second she lifted her head and straightened her spine and looked at the courtroom around her with clear, steady eyes. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. Wood. They came home to find that someone Ethan suspected the Aldrich family from the dry goods store, or perhaps the Danner household, or perhaps both, because Millhaven was small and news traveled fast, and people here had, as Sheriff Danner had noted, found Finch irritating on general principle, had left a covered dish on the porch step, and a note that said simply, "Glad it came right. Your neighbors." Clara stood and looked at it for a moment. "People here," she said. "People here," Ethan agreed. She picked up the dish and carried it inside. That evening after supper, after Cody had gone to the bunkhouse, walking slightly taller than usual after the dishes were done and the lamp was low, Ethan found Clara standing in the barn doorway with Duchess's head at her shoulder, the way the mare had taken to resting it heavy and trusting entirely without the nervous energy that had defined her before Clara arrived. He stood a few feet behind her. She said without turning, "He's gone. Gerald, I could feel when he left. I know that sounds—" "It doesn't sound like anything," Ethan said. "Tell me." "Oh, there's something I feel sometimes, not from animals, from situations, a kind of pressure that lifts." She turned around. Her face in the low light was open in a way he was only beginning to see regularly, that look she allowed herself when she was certain she was somewhere safe. "He's gone. Whatever he came here to do, he left without it. And I think—" She stopped. "What do you think?" "I think he's not coming back," she said. "Not because of the law. Because he looked at me on that street and I looked back and we both saw it clearly. He's lost the leverage, and without the leverage I'm not interesting to him." A pause. "I know that should feel worse than it does." "Does it feel bad?" "It feels like closing a window in winter," she said. "Cold first, then warm." He stood there looking at her. This woman who had packed one trunk and crossed a continent and walked into his life with her secrets and her precision and her iron-quiet discipline and her gift that had no name and her truth that cost her every time she gave it, and felt something in his chest that he was no longer going to pretend he didn't recognize. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He crossed the distance between them. He put his hands on either side of her face carefully, the way you handle something you know matters, and he said, "I am not good at this. I've told you that. But I need you to know something I haven't said yet, and I need to say it now because I've been a man who waits too long on the things that matter, and I am trying very hard to stop doing that." Her hands came up and covered his at her face. "I love you," he said. "Not because you're competent, and not because you saved my ranch, and not because Duchess trusts you. Because you are exactly who you are every single hour, without apology or performance. And because that is the rarest thing I've ever seen." He looked at her directly. "Because you sat on my porch step in the dark and told me what the real thing feels like, and I need you to know you're not the only one who's been trying not to be afraid of it." She stared at him. For a moment, she was perfectly still, that stillness that was thinking, that was going to the bottom and finding out what was there. Then she said, "I told you on the porch that I was trying not to be afraid. I need to tell you the rest of that sentence." "Tell me." "I'm trying not to be afraid of it," she said, "because it's real, because it is completely undeniably real, and because I have spent 5 years in a life that felt like a performance, and I know the difference." Her thumbs pressed lightly against the backs of his hands. "I love you. I have loved you since the night you told me I walked away, and that was the whole point." Her voice was steady and warm, and completely without armor. You saw the thing clearly when I couldn't. You do that. You do it quietly, and you never ask credit for it, and you have no idea how rare that is. He did not say anything else. He drew her in and held her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and neither of them moved for a long time, and Duchess stood in her stall and made no sound at all, which was in its own way, its own form of answer. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and still, and the ranch sat under the stars, exactly as it had for years. The house, the barn, the fence line running west, the East Creek running clear and uninterrupted through the land that was theirs. All of it exactly as it had always been, and completely, irrevocably different. The morning after, everything was the same and nothing was. The ranch didn't look different. The horses still needed feeding, the fence line still needed checking, the ledgers still needed balancing. Wyoming didn't rearrange itself to mark the occasion. The sun came up the same way it always did, hard and clean and indifferent, and Ethan was downstairs before it was fully light. Same as always, starting the fire, same as always putting the coffee on before Clara came down. Except that when she came down and found the fire already going, and the coffee already poured, and her cup sitting where it always sat, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with a different kind of looking than she'd had before. Not the careful measuring look she'd arrived with, not the guarded reading every exit look, but something open and certain, the look of a woman who has come home and knows it. She said, "You started the fire again." "Fire needed starting," he said. "You've been doing it every morning for 3 weeks." "Has it been 3 weeks?" She crossed to the table, picked up her cup, and said, "Thank you, Ethan." He looked up. She wasn't talking about the fire. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I am." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "The east pasture fence needs checking after yesterday's wind. I thought you might want to ride out with me." She had never been on a horse since arriving. He knew it. She knew it. Neither of them had addressed it directly. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "I'll get my coat." On horseback, with Duchess under her, and the land running out in every direction, and the morning still cold enough to see breath, Clara McAllister looked like a woman who had always belonged exactly there. Ethan rode beside her and watched it happen. Watched the last of the held-in tension leave her shoulders. Watched her hands go easy on the reins because Duchess had already decided she was safe. Watched her lift her face to the wind with the expression of someone setting down a weight they've carried so long they stopped noticing its shape. "You've ridden before," he said. A long time ago, before Boston." She looked straight ahead. "My mother kept 2 horses. Before she died, she used to say that the truest thing she knew was that a good horse will tell you more about a person in 10 minutes than a person will tell you in 10 years. "Smart woman," Ethan said. "She was." A pause. She would have liked Wyoming. She liked anywhere that was bigger than the rooms people tried to put her in. They rode the fence line in a comfortable quiet that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago, and felt completely natural now. When they found a downed post from the wind, Ethan dismounted to fix it, and Clara held both horses and talked to Duchess in that low, wordless way of hers, and the mare stood perfectly still and blew softly against her shoulder, and Ethan worked the post back into the ground and tried not to watch and watched anyway. "She loves you," he said, not looking up from the post. "Horses don't love the way people do," Clara said. "Maybe. But whatever they do, that's like it. She does it when she's with you." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "She was afraid for a long time. Whatever happened to her before you bought her something hurt her badly enough that she expected it again every single morning." She ran her hand along the mare's jaw. "She doesn't expect it anymore." Ethan drove the post in and looked at her. "Neither do you." She met his eyes. "No," she said quietly. "Neither do I." Cody asked with the absolute shamelessness of someone who has decided he has nothing to lose. The following question at breakfast, 3 days later. "Are you two happy now?" I'm asking directly because I've been watching for signs and I think I see signs, but I want to be sure. Clara said without looking up from the biscuit she was cutting. Cody. Yes, ma'am. Eat your breakfast. That's not a no. It is not a no, Clara confirmed. Cody looked at Ethan with the expression of a man whose entire investment in a situation has just paid out. Ethan gave him a look that communicated several things, primarily that this conversation was over. Cody ate his breakfast with tremendous personal satisfaction. That evening, when Cody thought no one could hear him, Ethan heard him in the barn talking to one of the younger horses, a skittish 2-year-old they'd been working with for weeks, in the same low, unhurried tone he'd been unconsciously adopting since watching Clara work. Not her gift, but her method, her patience, her willingness to meet a frightened thing where it was instead of demanding it come to where you were. Ethan stood at the barn door and listened to Cody talk that horse down from its usual sidling nervousness, and felt something he recognized as the specific pride of watching someone become more than they were. He didn't say a word about it. He went back to the house. But the next morning he told Clara what he'd heard, and she went very still for a moment, and then said, "He's been watching me work since the 2nd week. He thinks I don't notice. Do you mind?" Mind. She looked at him like he'd said something genuinely surprising. He's learning to be gentle with something that's afraid. Why would I mind? Hug. Within a month, the shape of the McAllister ranch had changed in ways Ethan couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have planned. Clara began working formally with the horses, not just Duchess, but the younger stock, the difficult ones, the 2 that Ethan had privately written off as untrainable. She didn't announce, it didn't ask permission, simply moved into the work, the way she moved into everything, quietly, effectively, without making noise about it. Word traveled the way it does in small counties, not as gossip, but as fact, one practical rancher to another. The Hendersons came out because their stallion had been dangerous for 2 seasons, and 3 trainers had failed. Clara spent 40 minutes with the animal, and came out of the paddock having done nothing visible, and the stallion followed her to the fence line, and stood there like a dog waiting to be told he was good. Frank Henderson looked at the horse, looked at Clara, said, "What do I owe you?" Clara said, "A fair price for Ethan's horses when he brings them to market." Henderson shook her hand on the spot. The Cartwright family came next, then the Albright brothers from the North Valley. And each time Clara worked without theater, without explanation, without performing anything for anyone. She simply was who she was, and it was enough, more than enough. Ethan watched the ledgers begin to change, not dramatically, not overnight, but the way a tide turns steadily, irresistibly, in a direction that cannot be reversed. He sat with the accounts one evening and looked at the numbers and thought, "My father spent 20 years building this to the edge of what one man could do." And then he looked across the room at Clara, who was reading by the lamp with her legs tucked under her and her shoes on the floor where she'd dropped them, and thought, "And she walked in and showed me the edge wasn't where I thought it was." He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. She looked up from her book and found him looking at her and read whatever was on his face with that instinct of hers, and said simply, "The Cartwrights want 2 horses trained by spring." "I heard," he said. "And the Henderson contract will—" "I know what it'll do," he said. "I'm looking at the numbers right now." She tilted her head slightly. "Then why do you look like you're not thinking about numbers?" "Because I'm not," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her book, and the small curve at the corner of her mouth stayed there. The letter from Boston arrived on a Thursday 6 weeks after Gerald Holt had walked out of the Millhaven Hotel and onto a coach east, and it was not from Holt. It was from Ashby's colleague, the one who had pulled the court records, who had found Mrs. Fitch, who had taken a sworn statement from a dead man's nurse and sent it across the country to save a woman he'd never met. The letter was brief and factual, which was exactly the right way to deliver what it contained. Gerald Holt had been formally charged by the Massachusetts court with fraud upon the court, the forged physician's affidavit, the fraudulent annulment. He had in addition been named in a civil suit by 2 of his former business partners, alleging misrepresentation in a horse trading agreement that bore suspicious similarities to what he'd attempted with Clara. The Holt Racing Stable was under financial review. His attorneys had advised him to settle. Clara read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a long, quiet moment. Ethan said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. Then, "I'm trying to understand what I feel." "What do you feel?" She thought about it genuinely, the way she always thought about things that mattered. "Not triumph," she said slowly. "Not the way I thought I would. Mostly I feel—" She stopped, started again. "I feel the way you feel when a door you've been bracing against finally stops pushing. Not victory. Just relief that you can put your shoulder down." "That's allowed," Ethan said. "I know it is." She looked up. "What he did to those other men, the business partners, that's what troubles me. I wasn't the only one he treated that way. He collected people to use, and when he was done with them, he found ways to bury them legally, so they couldn't push back." Her jaw tightened. "I hope the court sees every piece of it." "Ashby says his colleague will make sure they do," Ethan said. "He's thorough." "Yes," she said. "He is." She looked at the letter one more time. Then she folded it precisely, put it in the cedar box where they kept important documents alongside Ethan's father's original survey, alongside the water rights ruling, alongside the record of their marriage, and she closed the lid. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. The first winter together was hard, because Wyoming winters were hard, and made no exceptions for emotional developments, no matter how significant. The early cold came faster than expected. They lost a fence section in the first major storm, and spent 2 days in brutal conditions, repairing it all. 3 of them, Ethan, Clara, Cody, working until their hands went numb, and came back burning. Clara did not complain. She did not slow down. She worked beside Ethan in the frozen dark, and when he told her to go back to the house, she told him plainly, and with no drama, that she was exactly where she intended to be, and that was the end of that conversation. On the worst night of that winter, when the temperature dropped past anything reasonable and the wind was making the house shake at its frame, they sat close to the kitchen fire long after they should have slept, and Clara said something she'd been carrying for a while. "My mother used to say that love isn't what you feel," she said. "It's what you do with the feeling." Ethan looked at her. She said, "Feeling it is easy. Everybody feels it. What's rare is what you're willing to do because of it. What you're willing to stay through. What you build because of it, even when building is hard and cold and the fence keeps falling down." She looked at the fire. "I didn't understand it when she said it. I thought I did. I thought what I had with Gerald was what she meant." A pause. "It wasn't." "What did you think when you understood what she actually meant?" She looked at him. "I thought so. This is what she was talking about. This is it. Right here." He put his arm around her. She put her head against his shoulder. The fire held. Outside, the wind did its worst, and it didn't change a single thing inside that house. Spring came back like it always did, slowly, then all at once. The east pasture went green. The creek ran high and clear and entirely legally, undisputedly through McAllister land. Duchess delivered a foal, a strong, quick-tempered little mare that Clara named without being asked, calling her Boston, which made Ethan laugh, the real laugh, the one that escaped before he decided whether to mean it. "You're naming her Boston," he said. "I am reclaiming the word," Clara said with absolute seriousness, and a look in her eye that was entirely not serious. Boston grew up fast and difficult, and trusted exactly one person on the property from her first week of life, and that person's name was not surprising to anyone who'd been paying attention. Cody came to Ethan on a May morning with his hat in his hands and said he'd been offered a foreman position at the Aldrich operation to the north. A bigger spread, more responsibility, the kind of step up a young man needed to take when he was ready to become something more than a ranch hand. Ethan listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said, "When do they need an answer?" "End of the week." "Then give them your answer by Thursday." He looked at Cody. "Tell them yes." Cody blinked. "You don't need time to—" "I don't need time," Ethan said. "I know what you're worth, and I know what that job is worth, and I know you need to do it. I've known it since about February." He held out his hand. "You're a good hand, Cody. Go be a good foreman." Cody shook his hand. His face was doing something complicated that he was 19 years old, and therefore completely unequipped to hide. That evening, Clara made the particular biscuits that Cody had once said were the best thing he'd eaten since his mother's kitchen, and the three of them sat at the table and talked longer than usual, and nobody said the word goodbye, because the word wasn't needed. What was said was enough, and the table between them held it. On Cody's last morning, he stood in the yard with his gear packed and his horse saddled, and he looked at Clara and said, "Can I ask you something? The thing you do with the horses, does it work with people? Even a little?" Clara looked at him for a long moment with those reading eyes. "Why?" she said. He shrugged the elaborate casual shrug of a young man trying to ask a real question without sounding like he's asking a real question. "I've been scared my whole life of getting things wrong, making the wrong call, being the kind of man who lets people down. And then I watched you work and I thought—" He stopped. "I don't know what I thought." Clara stepped forward and put her hand briefly on his arm. "The thing I do with the horses," she said quietly, "is very simple. I hear what they're feeling and I let myself feel it with them. I don't try to fix it or rush it or correct it. I just say I hear you. You're not alone with this. And that's enough to start." She paused. "It works with people too. You've been doing it for months. You just didn't know what to call it." Cody stared at her. "I have the 2-year-old in the west stall, the one you've been working with in the evenings. You talk to him the way I talk to Duchess." He opened his mouth, closed it. "Go be a good foreman, Cody," Clara said. "You already know how." He got on his horse and rode out, and he did not look back because he was 19 and couldn't afford to, and Clara watched him go and didn't look away until he was out of sight. "You're going to miss him," Ethan said beside her. "Terribly," she said. "Don't tell him." "He knows." "I know he knows. Don't tell him anyway." A year passed, then another. The McAllister ranch grew not recklessly, not beyond what they could work and sustain, but steadily in the way that good land grows, when the people tending it understand what they have. The horse training operation became something known across 3 counties. Clara's name was attached to it, plainly and publicly, and no one in Millhaven found anything strange about that because Wyoming was not Boston, and the people here had spent enough time watching the McAllister horses to know exactly where the quality came from. Ethan's name was on the deed and on the contracts and in the county record, and he would not have had it any other way, but he made sure every time someone came to the ranch to talk business that they talked to both of them. He was not subtle about it. He was not strategic about it. He simply understood that this was not his ranch the way it had been his ranch before it was theirs, and theirs meant exactly that. Clara noticed. She always noticed. She told him once matter-of-factly that she'd never had a partner before, not a real one, not the kind who makes sure you're in the room and then listens when you talk in the room, and that she was still getting used to it. "Does it take getting used to?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "When you've spent years learning not to expect it, the real thing takes some adjustment." A pause. A good adjustment. On a September evening in the 3rd year, they sat on the porch step. The repainted step that Ethan had repainted twice before she arrived and had not touched since, because there was no longer any reason to. And they sat the way they'd learned to sit together close and quiet, watching the light go out of the sky. Their daughter was asleep inside. 8 months old, named Margaret, after Clara's mother already showing signs of something that made the horses in the barn consistently calm when she was carried past them, which neither of them had discussed yet, and both of them had noticed. Clara had her hand in Ethan's. He had his thumb moving slowly across her knuckles, the way he did when he wasn't thinking about doing it. The unconscious tenderness that had developed over 3 years of living beside someone, until tenderness is no longer an event, but a habit. She said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "When I answered your advertisement." She looked at the sky. "I told myself I was coming because of the land, because of the distance from Boston, because I needed somewhere no one knew my name." A long pause. "But I think the truth is simpler than that." I think I came because you wrote that you were a decent man, and you wrote it like you meant it. And I had been so long in the company of people who used words as instruments, weapons, or tools, never just words that honesty. Like that was something I could feel across 1,000 miles. Ethan said nothing. He listened. I had this gift my whole life, she said. And all my life people told me it was strange, or it was useful, or it was dangerous, or it was theirs. And the first night I sat at your table, you asked me about it. And the only thing in your face when I explained it was understanding. She turned to look at him. Not wonder, not calculation, just I hear you. That's what you are. That's allowed. She pressed her lips together for a moment. That was when I knew. Knew what, he said, though he thought he knew. That the gift was never the horses, she said. The horses were just the part people could see. The real thing, the thing I have that matters, is the capacity to hear what something is carrying and meet it there. To stay with it in the difficult place without needing it to be fixed or different. She looked at him. And the reason I know that's the real gift, the reason I know it means something, is because it's what you did for me. Before I could do it for myself. He looked at her in the September light. You heard me, Ethan, she said simply. Before I'd finished speaking, you heard what I was carrying and you stayed. You didn't run from the difficult parts, and you didn't try to make them smaller to make yourself more comfortable. You just stayed. Her eyes were clear and entirely certain. That is the rarest thing one human being can do for another. And you did it without knowing you were doing it, which means it's who you are. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, My father told me once a long time ago that the mark of a man worth anything is whether he can sit still in another person's trouble without making it about himself. He looked at his hand holding hers. I thought I knew what that meant. I didn't. Not until you came. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Inside the house, Margaret made a small sound and went quiet. The sound of a child resettling in sleep, small and safe, and entirely unaware that the world she'd been born into had been built deliberately carefully and with great love out of the ruins of two lives that had almost decided there was no such thing. You know what I want, Clara said quietly against his shoulder. Tell me. I want to stay right here, she said. This step, this ranch, this sky, this life. A pause. I want exactly what I have. Ethan tightened his hand around hers. Then that's what you have, he said. Years would pass, the ranch would grow, and the land would hold, and Millhaven would change slowly. The way small places change. New faces, old names. The Aldrich store, passing to the Aldrich daughter. Cody Briggs, making foreman and then partner at the North Valley operation, and coming back to the McAllister table twice a year, for those biscuits and staying half the day longer than he planned every time. Margaret would grow up knowing the horses before she knew many words, and the horses would know her the same way they knew her mother. That deep cellular recognition that needs no explanation. She would grow up knowing that the ranch had not always been easy, that it had been fought for in courts and in cold weather and in quiet conversations on a porch step at the end of hard days, and that none of it, not 1 acre of it, not one fence post, not one clear morning, had been an accident. She would ask her mother once when she was old enough to ask, "What's the best thing you ever did?" And Clara McAllister, who had packed one trunk and crossed a continent and walked into a stranger's life and turned it into a home, who had stood in a pasture with a rearing horse and not moved, who had told the truth every time the truth was hard and been believed. Every time she told it, Clara would look at her daughter and then across the yard to where Ethan was working the same way he always worked, steady and unhurried and entirely present, and she would say, "I answered a letter from a decent man, and I meant it when I said I hadn't come that far to leave." And that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough. And it was everything, the love that had never been a secret, only waiting to be found by two people stubborn and brave enough to stop running from the real thing and simply at last stay.